Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Mr. Hirbod, Dr. Amiri, dear friends, I promised my close friends here in San Francisco that whenever it were possible for me to come to the West Coast, I would try to come to San Francisco and give a lecture. And this was made possible by a happy event in my family. I was just made a grandfather again in San Diego. I had a second grandfather from my side of my son, and I telephoned Dr. Amiri. I said, I can break my program for a couple of days to come here, and here I am, alhamdulillah. But having done that, he asked me to speak about a subject which is very difficult, very, very sensitive, which nonetheless is of extreme importance, and that is the significance of the Sharia, what it means in the context of Islam as a religion. I think there is no need to mention how significant this issue is. The center where you're sitting right now, of course, would not be here had it not been for the need and desire on behalf of Muslims, primarily Persians, but also others, Pakistanis, Indians, Arabs, others, to practice the Sharia. And I really am very happy and pray to God that the activities of this center will go from strength to strength. And a center such as this, which must begin from the ground up and not descend with money from Islamic countries with strings attached from the outside, will grow in the United States as the Islamic community in this country now becomes part of the scene in America, and the question of how to practice the Sharia in a world very different from that of Iran or Pakistan or Egypt faces people of faith in this country. It's a very, very important and difficult issue. We have today people who say, well, the Sharia is everything, there's nothing else in Islam but the Sharia, want to flaunt the intellectual and artistic and mystical aspects of Islam. There are others who go to the other extreme and to say, well, everything is in the Quran, what is all this Sharia you're talking about? I will interpret the Quran as I will. This is a very serious disease which will end up with having 1.2 billion schools of law corresponding to 1.2 billion Muslims all over the world, each of whom will interpret the Quran as he or she wills. And this point of view, of course, is based on utter disrespect for the grandeur of religion and revelation, and an utter misunderstanding of our own worth in interpreting it. It is really to inflate the ego, to think that we can simply go to the Quran, put aside 1400 years of Islamic tradition and thought, put aside the hadith, the inspired commentaries, the work of great jurists over the centuries, and here we are because we have a degree from some American English university and we know some Arabic, we open the Quran and understand what it is. It's not accidental. Excuse me, that in the Quran it is said that God guides whom He wills and also leads astray whom He wills. يَضِلُّ مَنْ يَشَاءُ. And it is possible to read the Quran and even be misguided if one doesn't have the guidance of tradition, and especially of the guidance of the Prophet ﷺ, who was the first commentator upon the Quran, and the Hadith is really the first commentary. So we're placed at the present moment, not only here, but in England, in other European countries where there are small Islamic communities, caught between these two poles, both of which I believe are totally incorrect. As for each person simply going to the Quran and trying to interpret what Islam is, that I said would lead to a kind of disorganized and disoriented and centerless, amorphous Islamic community, which would be even more diversified than Protestantism became after it cut itself off from Catholicism. There are now 350 Protestant churches. There will be many more Islamic interpretations if that continues. As for saying, all right, Islam is only the Sharia and nothing else, it is to flaunt, first of all, the text of the Quran, in which the ayat, the verses which concern human action, form only a small part of all of the 6,000 some verses of the Quran, most of which concern the nature of reality and the description of the world of nature and the significance of thinking, of tadabbur and tafakkur and tafa'ul and ta'aqqul and all of these different verbs than tafaqquh, which are used in the Quran, and different levels of meaning of thinking and understanding of God's signs. When God says, contemplate the heavens and the earth, this does not have to do with how to act, but how to think. And really the final answer, philosophical answer to those who try to limit the message of Islam only to the plane of action is to forget that Islam is based on Tawheed and unity. Now God has created us in such a way that not only do we act, but we do at least two other things. We think and we make. Of course, making is a kind of action, but not exactly the same thing. That is, Islam, in order to be able to integrate the whole of man and women into its perspective, has to have a guidance for how to think and a guidance for how to make, from which issue all the intellectual dimensions of Islam and all the artistic dimensions of Islam, to which I will allude at the end. But having said that, having tried to clear these two extremes, which today are like an illness confronting the Islamic community, especially outside of the main area of the Islamic world, the main area of Dar al-Islam, it is important to try now to understand, first of all, when we say, what is the significance of Sharia? What do we mean by the Sharia? There are many young people here who do not really even know what do we mean by the Sharia. Is the Sharia a certain verse of the Quran? Is a certain books written in days of old which we read and then we put into action? Is it traditions handed down by our ancestors, by our fathers and mothers about how to do things? What is the Sharia? First of all, its name. Of course, the word Sharia is related to road, to path. Even today in Arabic, if you go to Cairo, instead of saying avenue so-and-so, it says ashara, which means road or avenue, path. Therefore, it's the path to God. The Sharia is the path to God. How did it come about? How did it come about? This is a very, very sensitive issue. According to all schools of Islamic law, both Sunni and Shiite, the root of the Sharia is contained in the Quran. But in the same way that a root needs water and soil and needs to be fed and needs sunlight in order to grow into a full-fledged tree, it is not possible for human beings to draw the consequences of the ahkam, that is the injunctions of the Quran, whose roots are injunctions of the Sharia, whose roots are contained in the Quran, without the help of other sources. Of these, the most important is hadith, the sayings and the doings of the Prophet of Islam. The best way to translate the word Sunnatun Nabi, that is the traditions of the Prophet, is to translate it by the English word wont, W-O-N-T, which is not used very much in American English. When we say hadith, that is not sufficient, because that only refers to the sayings of the Prophet. The Sunnah includes both his sayings and his doings. That is the model that the Prophet ﷺ provided for us on the basis of the Quran. As I mentioned to you, the hadith is the first commentary upon the Quran, without which we will not be able to understand the Sharia. That is why all schools of law agree on these twin sources of the Sharia, that is the Quran and the Hadith. After that, the differences of perspective, both among Sunni jurists and the Ja'fari school and other schools of Shiite law, such as the Zaydi and the Ismaili. But we all agree, all Muslims agree, on the significance of the Quran and the Hadith as foundations for the Sharia. In Shiism, of course, the Hadith of the Prophet ﷺ is extended to that of the Ma'sumin, of the Imams, ﷺ, who in a sense extend the Muhammadan light within their being, that is, God extends it within their being, and therefore what they say is a kind of both commentary and extension of the sayings of the Prophet. And therefore, in Shiite sources, as you know, we have what in Arabic is called ahadith nabawiyya and ahadith walawiyya. That is hadiths which come from the Prophet ﷺ, and hadith which come from the Shiite Imams. Many of which are also very important, interesting enough, in Sunni Islam, especially the sayings of the 5th and 6th Shiite Imams, who lived at the end of the Umayyad period, at the time when the political situation in the Islamic world became somewhat more loosened and permitted them to have large number of disciples, both Sunni and Shiite, and therefore a very large number of sayings of these 5th and 6th Imams, especially, to some extent the 7th, were assembled together. Anyway, I'm not going to be able in this hour to analyze for you all of the detailed methods by which the Sharia grew from these sources, in addition to other sources which in Sunni law are important, more important than in Shiite law, such as, for example, Ijma', that is the consensus of the community, and juridical analogy, qiyas, and so forth and so on. That is not for tonight's discussion. The important to consider is that the Sharia is not part of the Quran which we would go and read. It's the roots of the Sharia which are contained in the Quran. There are many injunctions of the Sharia which are explicitly stated in the Quran. There are others which are not mentioned except in principle. The most important of which is the central act of all of Islam, the heart of the Sharia, that is the daily prayers. The Quran says, Salli, that is the command form in Arabic, pray. But how do we pray? The how comes, of course, from the Sunnah of the Prophet. It is he who taught us how to pray. Otherwise, if you read the whole of the Quran, you'll never find out how to pray. Some people think there's a particular chapter of the Quran where this is described. It's not. So we must understand the centrality of the Quran as the root of the Sharia, but the necessity of the interpretation made by the Prophet, and the fact that God chose him as the model which we should emulate in the practice of religion in order for the Sharia to gradually take roots and grow into the tree that it is. From the philosophical point of view of Islamic jurisprudence, the Sharia is the concrete embodiment of the will of God. To be a Muslim, you have to be surrendered to God's will. That's what it means to be a Muslim. Islam is related to that. We all want to surrender ourselves to God's will. But what is God's will? What is God's will? What does He want us to do in the morning, every morning that we get up? We know certain general principles. He wants us to be good. He wants us not to lie. He wants us not to commit adultery. He wants us not to commit murder. These are like the 10 Commandments in Christianity and Judaism and in other religions. But Islam goes a step further. It wants the followers of the religion to be able to follow God's will in a concrete fashion. And the Sharia is what I call the concrete embodiment of the divine will. That it is through the Sharia, the practice of the Sharia, that we come to learn what God expects of us. On the level of action, how we interpret it inwardly is something else I shall get to in a moment. On the level of action, therefore, it encompasses, first of all of the principles of worship, what's called the ibadat in Arabic, ibadat in Persian, that is daily prayers, fasting, almsgiving, the pilgrimage, other lesser central religious practices. All of these are part of the Sharia. And man is not only a worshipping animal, he has to work, he has to make a living, he has to have contact with other human beings, he has to procreate, he has to have a family. So it also includes, in a concrete fashion, the responsibilities which we have in a circle which grows from the individual and ends up with God Himself. That is, first of all, our responsibility to ourselves. For example, according to the Sharia, we cannot commit suicide. Since we did not create ourselves, we cannot take our life away. Our life doesn't belong to us. We must try to keep ourselves healthy. We cannot do something that we are conscious that is bad for us. Unless we are weak, that's something else. But do something which harms the body, that is against the Sharia. Then from that central responsibility to ourselves. That is, the Sharia governs the relation between ourselves and ourselves, which is very, very significant. That is, it comes between the ego and that spiritual self within us, which is God's representatives in our heart. From that central assertion, then we have the relation with the most immediate people around us, our family, wife, father, mother, children, aunt, cousin, and so forth and so on, which is the immediate society of each human being. All of the relationships are governed by injunctions of the Sharia. For example, the respect towards parents. وَلِلْوَالِدَيْنِ إِحْسَانًا, the Quran says you should have respect for your parents. But that's also promulgated in the Sharia in a concrete fashion. It's the responsibility of children to take care as much as possible of their parents, to have respect for them no matter what they do. It's irrelevant whether they're good parents or bad parents. That's totally irrelevant. The fact that God has decided that we should come into this world as a result of these two agents, the father and the mother, that need certain special respect on our behalf, of our brothers, our sisters, of what's called salatul arham, of visiting of relatives and so forth, which are all parts and parcel of the pattern of the Sharia. Then you have a larger circle than that, your immediate community. In the old days, the Muslims had a very close relationship with their immediate quarter of the city, you might say. Not only the whole country, the new word watan, and used in Arabic, or mihan watan in Persian, is a 19th century term. In the old days, when the Prophet said, Hubb al-watan min al-iman, that is the love of one's watan, comes from faith, it did not mean nationalism that came out of the French Revolution. It meant the immediate place where we were born. If it were a village, it would include the whole village. If it were a big city, which is the quarter of the city. I remember when I was a child, for example, my family comes from the Shabad Avenue district of Tehran. The Nasr family lived there for a long, long time. It was an attachment to that part of Tehran for our family. Unfortunately, later on, we are scattered and ended up in Sacramento and Washington and other places. But at that time, there was a sense of attachment. And then the larger community, which was acceptable if you were an Arab or a Persian or a Yemeni or a Sudanese or tribe and so forth. And then even the larger, the Ummah itself, the whole of the Islamic people. And then beyond that, the whole of humanity. And even beyond that, the whole of creation. The Sharia promulgates laws about how we should deal with the whole of creation. There's an element of Sharia that's becoming very significant now that we are murdering creation very rapidly through the environmental crisis, and I use this word not excessively. We are murdering God's creation, cutting its throat, but somewhat slowly so he doesn't realize it's bleeding to death thanks to our actions. This aspect of Sharia is extremely significant. So you have a series of concentric circles from the individual towards himself or herself, to the immediate family, to the quarter of the city or village, that which you feel humanly as belonging to, not a metropolis of 10 million people, you have no personal relationship. Then the bigger community, then finally the Ummah, that is the whole of the Islamic people, then all of humanity, and then finally the whole of creation. So the Sharia also includes our relation with our cat and dogs, of treating our mules, the fact that they were in what the West calls the Middle Ages. There were actually veterinary hospitals in the Islamic world before anywhere else in the world. That is, hospitals just for mules whose backs were bruised for carrying weight in towns. There's still some left in Fez and in Damascus from the old days, you can still see it. Had to do with precisely the promulgations of the Sharia. So the Sharia goes in a series of concentric circles which encompasses the whole life of action in our world. Now, the question comes up, which has now been debated very heatedly in the Islamic world and in a new light in Iran itself. The question is the Sharia static or dynamic? Is God's will for us a static pattern, or does it change with the circumstances? This is one of the most powerful and difficult problems that the Islamic world has faced during the last century. It did not face it before because Islamic civilization was strong enough in other periods to impose its values upon the environment around it. I always give this example. When Genghis Khan's grandson, Hulagu, invaded Khorasan and later the rest of Persia and Iraq and killed about 20 million people in that area, it was a very major catastrophe. He brought with him Mongolian laws, which for a while in Iran were being implemented. But no one in the world at that time thought, well, we have to keep up with the times. The times are the times of the Mongols, so let's change Islamic law according to the times. I don't know of any single jurist or Islamic thinker who had that view. But since the 19th century, because of the power of Western civilization during the colonial period and following after the wake of the colonial period, we're still in the colonial period, but in another dress. It hasn't changed completely, but it's the political colonial period coming to an end. This foreign civilization was so powerful militarily and politically that gradually it weakened the will of many people in the Islamic world, who began to say that we must accommodate the Sharia to the changing conditions of the times. And the great debate came up, which goes on as a major question within the whole of the Islamic world. From Indonesia to Morocco, the Sunni world, the Shiite world, doesn't matter where it is, whether Sharia is to be adopted to the world around us or the world around us is to be made according to the Sharia. This is a very important question, and it's not the question to be answered tonight. I've already, in some of my writings, have written about this in a rather categorical way. Everyone knows where I stand on this, and it can be summarized by a lecture which I gave in India in 1962 when they were going to change the Muslim personal law. The story I oftentimes told my students because of one of the critical moments of my life in front of the late Jawaharlal Nehru and Radhakrishnan, who was then President of India, and Indira Gandhi, who was then bringing her father around, and all of the dignitaries of India and all of the ulama of India that assembled this session in order to convince the Indian Muslims. There was during the first Congress of Orientalism ever held in Asia. And they had speakers from Egypt and Turkey and several Islamic countries. And unfortunately for India, they also had me as a speaker from Iran. Because the other people just say, oh yes, we have to change the personal laws, we have to keep up with the times, the situation in India is different. But somehow during that day, the blood of my ancestors said, Seyyed Hossein curdled in my veins, and I said I couldn't say this nonsense. And I made this comment that if we have to change with the times, what do the times have to change with? And nobody could answer that question. And the whole thing cracked. And in fact, it saved this Muslim personal law for the next 30 years. It was very interesting. Historically, you should know that Nehru was sitting just where this young man is sitting from Pakistan. And he had a heart attack right in front of me. That was Nehru's heart attack. I mean, it was unbelievable how tense that atmosphere was. And it was dragged out. And that was the beginning of the end of Nehru. My position has always been very clear that Islam cannot surrender itself to external conditions on the excuse that you have to accommodate yourself to those conditions. Because the question comes up, upon what principles are those conditions functioning? What are those conditions? If those conditions are in accordance with Islamic principles, fine. If they're not, we must try to change those conditions, not to try to change the principles. However, having said this, it must be understood that the Sharia has never been like a static building. It is like a great tree. A tree is both static and dynamic. If the roots of a tree were to be dynamic, the tree would die immediately. You would not have a tree left in your garden next spring. But if the branches were not dynamic, the tree would have died anyway. The tree is a wonderful symbol of the combination of status and endynamis in Greek, that is the static and the dynamic. Because, as I said, the roots of the tree are firm, and that's what gives the life to the tree. But as long as the tree is alive, its branches grow. And if there's a difficult winter, it grows somewhat differently from when the winter is not so harsh. That's natural. Now the Sharia is like that tree. It is both static and dynamic. That is, the Sharia can accommodate itself in the sense that if you and I are in a plane and flying from here to New Zealand and the plane will not land, what do we do with our daily prayers? It's not like the old caravanserais where the camels would stop for ask prayer, where we get off the camel and say their prayers and get on the camel again. What do we do? Or what do we do if you're driving all day long? What do we do in this hectic life that we have in American cities? How to be able to perform the rites and so forth and so on. Those, the Sharia can always accommodate itself to, but it cannot surrender its principles to something which is against the principles contained in the Quran and the Hadith. So this great debate that is going on, I know in Iran, it's been like a flame that has, in a sense, caused a fire in many, many circles during the last 10 years on whether the Sharia is static or dynamic. And the debate has also reached Qom, as it exists in Al-Azhar University and other centers of also Sunni learning, about the question of static and dynamic. And most of the problem does not have to do with the Sharia. It has to do with the inferiority complex of Muslims vis-a-vis civilization, towards which many of them feel psychologically inferior. And not that they are inferior, but they feel psychologically inferior. Therefore, in a sense, they are inferior, but they're not in reality. But they feel that. And therefore, they always try to accommodate. They don't want to change the situation on the ground. They always want to conform themselves to the situation on the ground. And if that follows, in the future, I believe that Islam will end up like Protestant Christianity, in which religion is always changed to conform to the times. In the 19th century, Christianity tried to accommodate itself to the 19th century. By now, everything in the 19th century is out of fashion. It sounds very funny, but the Schleiermacher wrote in the 19th century in Germany. No serious Protestant theologian would follow that. But at that time, that was the up-to-date theology. And since you invited me to talk here, my view has always been that the only thing which is timely is the timeless. And to be up to date is to be out of fashion very quickly, out of date. Anything that's up to date, it's terrible, religiously speaking, because by the time you finish your sentence, it is already out of date. So this desire that we have to be always up to date, I think, is one of the great psychological ailments of modern society. What I call the absolutization of the transient. We always absolutize the transient flow around us. We try to make values out of things which change all the time, and then criticize God-given institutions on that basis. This is a crisis which Catholicism faces, Hinduism faces, Judaism faces, and Islam also faces. It's a very, very important international crisis. But as far as Islam is concerned, the role that the Sharia has played over the centuries has always been to have its roots like the root of a tree, static. And static in the sense that is the divine reality. God, of course, is Al-Hayy and Al-Muhyi. He is both life and the giver of life. But He is also Al-Mateen. He is permanent. He does not change. And from that changelessness, which is the Quranic revelation, His word, you have the aspect of status. From the inner life of Islam, which God determined to live in under all circumstances, you have the dynamic aspect. And in the future will tell to what extent the Muslims will be able to face this challenge, as Muslims of old did. When Islam went to China, can you imagine how difficult it was to apply the Sharia in a country in which everything has pork in it, including ice cream, practically? What to do to create a kind of living space for themselves, to be able to practice the Sharia. It was not an easy matter, but they did it. There are 100 million Chinese Muslims. When Islam came to India, a land where divinity was symbolized by various statues and what appeared to be like pre-Arabic, pre-Islamic Arabic idolatry, although it's not that at all. But the Muslims understood that very quickly and were able to create a major Islamic civilization right amidst the vast sea of Hinduism. When Islam went to Black Africa, when it went to Senegal, to Nigeria, it was very different from Mecca and Medina or Isfahan and Tus. It was a very different world, but the Sharia remained permanent while accommodating itself to various circumstances. And that, I believe, is the key to the understanding of this very difficult issue, which many Muslims think about, the question of the static and the dynamic, of the principle and its application to the world in which we live. Of course, this brings me up to the question, if the Sharia is applicable to all situations, who can then carry out Ijtihad? The famous term, which has been bandied about by so-called Islamic reformers, most of whom are called deformers, since the 19th century. Everybody wants to do Ijtihad. Everybody says, oh, the gate of Ijtihad was closed, it should open. First of all, in Shiism, of course, Ijtihad was never closed, the gate of Ijtihad. All of these things that we read in these books is not true of 12 Imam Shiism. And in Sunnism, the gate was never closed. The people who had the qualifications to carry out Ijtihad didn't appear on the scene. This is one thing, and so many scholars write about. They should read the classical Sunni texts. What are the conditions that a person who is to be a mujtahid must have? The conditions were so stringent that after the 5th Islamic century, no one appeared like Imam Shafi'i to fulfill all of those conditions. There's nothing written in Sunni law that you cannot have another school of law or mujtahids. It's the question of who will fulfill the conditions. In Shiite law, you cannot not have ijtihad in every generation. Every generation must have those who can practice ijtihad. Now, the term ijtihad has been branded about, as I said, a great deal since the time of Sayyid Ahmad Khan and Muhammad Abdo, these people. Muhammad Iqbal, when you read him, every other word that he uses is ijtihad. Recently, someone wrote an article comparing yours truly with Muhammad Iqbal, a very famous Russian philosopher and Urdu scholar, who said one big difference is that Iqbal uses the term ijtihad all the time and I don't use it at all. I have used it from time to time, but I don't use it on purpose because it has been really reduced to triviality practically, to the extent that anyone who goes and studies, let's say with Montgomery Watts and get his doctorate on early Islamic history at the University of Edinburgh, thinks now he can do ijtihad, he can carry out ijtihad. First of all, the moral qualifications. Where are the moral qualifications? Where are the real intellectual qualifications of really knowing the Quran and Hadith and all the earlier commentaries and studies by the great jurists over the ages? Where are they? I think once you get people who are at the level of ijtihad, ijtihad will be carried out. You don't have to talk about it. It needs a first-rate mind. Otherwise, anyone can get up in the morning and say, I'm carrying out ijtihad. And you end up with this disorder that we see in so much contemporary Islamic thought, in which a lot of people are saying a lot of things which 20 years later nobody even pays attention to. They are expressing, in the name of ijtihad, personal opinion. Ijtihad is not personal opinion. Ijtihad is a form of jihad. It comes from the same root. It is an exertion in the path of God on the basis of established principles to be able to take another step. And ijtihad is not limited to jurisprudence. It's not limited to the Sharia. You can carry out ijtihad in medicine, in physics, in philosophy, in kalam, in all different fields of endeavor. But to do that, you have to be a master. It's true in the field of physics today. Just let me give this example. A lot of people get their PhDs in physics, even from Berkeley or MIT, some good university. That doesn't mean every one of them can do ijtihad in physics. You have to be Werner Heisenberg or Einstein to do ijtihad. In that sense, that's how Islam understands ijtihad. That is somebody who's able to take the principles and teachings and findings of a science and take a new step. And this has been done in the field of physics only once or twice in the last few centuries. 4 or 5 times, I should not over-exaggerate. But all of these nice scientists we have around us, they're not performing ijtihad. They just work in the laboratories with the already given paradigms which they're applying to certain problems. To do ijtihad is precisely like the examples that I gave you. To, let's say, develop quantum mechanics, you have to be Niels Bohr or bring up the theory of relativity. Now, we Muslims understand this in the field of physics, but when it comes to the question of Sharia, we're all practicing ijtihad all the time. Of course, that is the suicide of a religion. It must be fully understood who can practice ijtihad. It's very interesting that in Ithna Ashari Shiism, So many difficult conditions were put on the practice of ijtihad. Who could be a mujtahid? And many people who had the signature, like getting a PhD, the piece of paper from the great teacher, and who were supposed to be mujtahids, the community did not accept them as mujtahid because there was a kind of ethical and moral element that was connected to it. It was a kind of invisible assertion of the ijtihad quality, or mujtahidhood, if I can use such a term, that is the state of being a mujtahid, which the community of believers exercised. Throughout the history of Iran, let's say, put Iraq aside, since the Safavid period, when the political power in Iran, since today, has been always Shiite. Of course, there are always political machinations who should be pushed forward, whether in the old days by the Persian kings, today by the powers in Iran, some elements pushed forward, someone is eclipsed, and so forth and so on. That has never in the long run really had affected who are the real mujtahids, who are really the person who leave an imprint upon Islamic law, upon the Sharia, and other Islamic sciences. Now, I want to turn to the question which I started with: is the Sharia the whole of Islam or not? Is the Sharia Islam or is it not? If you were to ask me this question openly, my answer would be yes and no. Both yes and no. And what do I mean by that? Yes, if you understand by the Sharia all the levels of its meaning, including the inner meaning of the Sharia. No, if you mean by the Sharia only the outward meaning, that is the aspect of the fiqh or juridical aspect of the Sharia. The Prophet of Islam said, Al-a'malu bin-niyat, that is, God judges our actions according to our intentions. Now, the Sharia deals with our actions. The niyyah is between us and God. It is not governed by the Sharia. If someone says it's 2 units of prayers, Islamic society has no right to judge whether he's being very pious and attentive inwardly towards God or not. That is between him and God. Everybody knows that. The mufti, the muhtasib, the religious scholar can criticize someone for turning his head around in the middle of the prayers. That's part of the outward countenance that we must have in order to perform the Sharia. But whether our heart is really with God, that's something else. It's one thing to perform the acts of the Sharia. It's another thing to really perform the Sharia. You all know, most of you are Shiites here, that in one of the great battles, somebody has shot an arrow into the feet, into the actual lower ankle of Ali, alayhi salam. And it was too painful to pull out. So one of the Sahaba, one of the companions said, wait until Ali is praying. When he prays, he is in Mi'raj, and he will not feel it. Just pull the arrow out at that time. That's what they did. Now, that's not the kind of prayer that we do. If in the middle of prayer somebody pricks a little needle, we'll feel it, not what to pull out an arrow with its prong like this out of one's flesh. So the quality of prayer, what it means inwardly, is not governed by the juridical aspect of the Sharia. So on the one hand, yes, the Sharia, the whole of Islam, if you understand all of its inner meanings. But it's not the whole of Islam if you mean by it the ahkam, the injunctions which it promulgates. Now, if you understand it as the ahkam, that is the principles of an injunction that it promulgates, then what does it leave out? What is Islamic which is outside of the Sharia? In the second meaning of it, don't misquote me ever. In a sense, there's nothing outside of the Sharia. But in the second sense, if we mean by the Sharia, the juridical regulations, that if you go to the bazaar, that's how you should buy cabbage. If this is how much you should pay for zakat, this is what you should do if you build a wall next to your neighbor. This kind of aspect of the Sharia. What is outside of it? Of course, it's the classical division of the whole of Islam into al-Islam, al-Iman, and al-Ihsan, which is in the Hadith Jibreel, or of the Sharia, the Tariqah, and the Haqiqah. That is the divine law, the path to God and the divine truth, which is the source of both the way and the law. We all know that. But to try to analyze that a little bit, you might say that the tariqah, which of course also means spiritual practice, refers to the inner quality of ethics. In Islam, ethical norms come from the Sharia, but the spiritual virtues come from the inner life. Ethics must be understood in two different ways. One is regulations of how to act. In that sense, in Islam, there is no ethics outside of the Sharia. There is no ethics outside of Sharia. Another meaning of ethics is our inner spiritual attitude or even philosophical attitude towards what is good and evil, how to cultivate certain virtues, how to rise in the degree of humility, how to be more loving towards other creatures, and so forth and so on. That type of spiritualized ethics belongs really to the tariqah, and throughout the history of Islam, it's been primarily Sufism or mystical aspects of Shiism, like we have in the case of Mullah Mohsen Faiz Kashani, who have sort of tried to inbreathe an inner spiritual quality into religious ethics. Because without this spiritual element, religious ethics can tend to be hypocritical, a holier-than-thou attitude, loss of humility, which is one of the conditions that entails us human beings in whatever situation we happen to be. And in a religious society, it manifests itself as religious hypocrisy. And that is why you have all of these examples of great saintly men and women in Islam who have, in a sense, debunked the outer criterion for the judgment of the meaning of human action, of even doing things which were antinomian, which were very strange, going all the way to the extreme of the people who call them Malamatiyya in Sufism, came from Khorasan originally, and later on spread into Egypt and Spain, all over. These people who on purpose cultivated certain acts which outwardly seemed to be against the norm, but inwardly showed their resignation to God and the fact that they would not allow their ego to inflate itself outwardly. There's a wonderful example, many examples of this. First of all, the great Sufi Ibn Arabi says that all Muslims and all Sufis, the highest are the Ahlul Malama, the highest of them. Because in a sense, they do not do anything except for the sake of God. They do not do things to be proper and correct. And all of these stories we have in Persian, Arabic, about inner ethics compared to the outward relates to that. You all know the story, which has been repeated in many books of Attar, others, Tazkiratul Awliya of Jami, of the fact that you had a very sort of self-righteous, pious merchant in the bazaar, which is a phenomenon in the Islamic world always. Because religion is strong, people tried, in the old especially, to appear very pious. They would sell you, peanuts in place of real butter, but they would have a sign here on their forehead showing that they prayed 200 times a day. You all know that phenomenon. And one of these types of pseudo-religious hajis came to the mosque to go to the Friday prayer. And a dervish, a real dervish, a person who followed the inner ethics, was sleeping right in front of the mosque. And so this fellow kicked him. And he said, "Get up, what kind of Muslim are you? You're not coming to the congregational prayers." So he opened up his eyes and closed his eyes again and went back to sleep. And then the prayers were finished, and as the man was coming back out of the mosque, when he came back through the door, the dervish opened his eyes. And he said, "My dear friend, you know very well that during all the 2 rakahs of prayers you were performing, you were thinking of nothing but of the profits you were going to make during the week. Well, as I, with my eyes closed, were thinking of nothing but God." And then, of course, the person became upset by this and changed his path, changed his ways. So spiritualized ethics is not in the domain of the Sharia understood as the juridical aspect of Islam. The second important field is the intellectual domain. The whole of the intellectual endeavor. No religion can survive without an intellectual vision of the world. Usually religion becomes corrupted, not by outward action, but by the corruption of the mental landscape. It is that which occurs first, and then the lack of interest in performing the Sharia or doing this or that follows suit. There's no doubt about that. Now, Islam developed an immense intellectual edifice: philosophy, metaphysics, Sufism, Kalam, Usul al-Fiqh, the sciences, you name it. This is a subject which I've concerned myself all of my life. And although 40 years I've been working on this, I'm still drowning in the ocean, how vast it is really, how remarkably vast, how rich the Islamic intellectual tradition is. This is not an innovation. It is not a bid'ah. It is not something extraneously added from the outside. Those types of Muslims, usually now greased by oil money from certain countries in the Middle East who think so, they have their mind filled completely by false ideas from Western civilization and then say their prayers all the time, thinking that mind has nothing to do with how one lives, how one acts. In a sense, they've secularized their mental landscape by rejecting the Islamic intellectual tradition. And when you look at the Quran, as I said, over half of the verses of the Quran are about intellectual matters. They're not about laws of how to act. They're about how to think, how to be, the nature of God, of the universe, of causality, principle of life, principle of action, but not action itself. Certain verses are about actions. If you die, this much of your inheritance goes to your son, this to your daughter, this to your wife, and so forth and so on. So the whole Islamic intellectual edifice is not part of the Sharia. The Sharia has always set the external conditions for the flowering of Islamic intellectuality. But it has not been the cause of that Islamic intellectuality. The cause of it goes back to the Quran and the Hadith, and the definition of aql given in the Quran, which in fact opened the aql of Muslims towards the reception of many different possibilities. Not only the Quran itself, look at the Hadith of the Prophet, the collections of Hadith, Sunni Hadith, Bukhari, Tirmidhi, all of these. Study it once to see how many of the Hadiths really deal with what we would call the intellectual life. More specifically, you turn to Shiism, the Natural Balagha, which as a single book is the second most important book of Islamic civilization after the Quran, not only for Shiite Islam, but also for Sunni Islam. And therefore, it's amazing that it's been so much belittled and disregarded in Western scholarship. We still don't have a complete translation of the Natural Balagha directly from the Arabic. I commissioned many years ago when the Mohammadi Trust was going in London, Dr. Jafari of Karachi to do that. I didn't finish it. After we finished the Sahifa Sajadiyya, which my dear friend and student William Chittick translated into excellent English, we're going to the Natural Balagha and didn't finish. We do not have one single translation of this book done directly from Arabic. There are excellent Persian translations. The latest one by my friend Dr. Shahidi. Many of you are Persians here. You can read that if you cannot read the Arabic. Excellent translation. Now, what does the Natural Balagha talk about? Most of it is about thinking, about using your aql, and about catastrophes of our times. Is that a number of people who are too weak to face the intellectual challenges of the West, in a sense, hide themselves in a position taken by the Damascene jurist Ibn Taymiyyah, who says the word aql itself is like using the word water. It's simply a word that does not correspond to a reality. And therefore what is important is the naql and the worship, and we don't have to think. Unfortunately, the Islamic world is very good in not thinking. You're excellent in that. And this is not the most glorious period of our history from that point of view, because during most of its history, Islam, of course, was at the forefront as far as thinking is concerned. You cannot have a serious Islam without thinking, but many people think one can. And finally, is a question of making, of art. Now, art, as many puritanical rationalists think today, is not something that has to do with luxury, something that has to do with simply extraneous matters or passions. It is at the very heart of religion. What is my proof of this? That the Prophet ordered the Quran, and the Quran itself orders us to read the Quran in what in English would be called artistically. That is an art to read the Quran. It is a supreme art of Islam. You never read you just heard this beautiful chanting. The voice was beautiful. It was a music, although we don't use the word music for the Quran, but it's a form of artistic form of music. And it is a supreme art. Always throughout the history of Islam, good voices were chosen. You would never choose a person who has a bad voice to recite the Quran, and also the adhan. And then the beautiful architecture which flowed out of early Islamic civilization, which made Islam a reality. All of this also is not governed by the Sharia. The Sharia governs the external conditions. That is what Islamic architecture cannot do. But it doesn't tell you how to build mosques, how to build buildings, how to do calligraphy, all of the great arts of Islam, which issue really from the haqiqah of the Quran, the issue from the inner reality of the Quran. And that is why the great forms of Islamic art, whether it's poetry, architecture, calligraphy, when you face it, you face the very inner reality of Islam. The dear friend who died many years ago in Europe, Titus Burkhardt, who first brought the inner meaning of Islamic art to the West, once someone asked him, a European, what is Islam? He said, Islam is for you to stand in front or in the middle of the Ibn Tulun Mosque in Cairo. That is Islam. Or some other mosque like that. Now, this remarkable artistic development that took place, perhaps richest of all in my own country, Iran, but I don't want to be chauvinistic, but also in other parts of the Islamic world, in Egypt, especially Mamluk Egypt, in India, in Maghreb, marvelous art of Andalusia, was not by accident. It grew out of the inner meaning of the Quranic revelation. It's bound in the most delicate way with both the inner meaning and even the cadence and form of the Quran, including the way the Quran speaks about various things, which in a kind of discontinuous manner is like an arabesque, ever-repeating arabesque. The very expression of the Quran, it flows from that, and it does not come from the Sharia. The Sharia sets the external conditions for it. So to this crucial question, is the Sharia the whole of Islam? The answer would be yes and no, according to how we interpret the Sharia. But let me conclude by saying, although these three very important domains, there is the domain of the spiritual life, the inner meaning of ethics, the domain of the intellectual life, the domain of the artistic life of Islam, issue from other dimensions of Islam than the juridical and the Sharia. Nevertheless, one can never leave the Sharia, no matter how exalted one becomes. This is important to mention, especially here in California, where you now are beginning to get this kind of aberrant manifestations of Sufism without the Sharia, like you had among certain people in India called Tasawwuf bil Shar. But that was a very, very minor phenomenon. But this can happen in this country and in Europe. And it's very important to remember that the Prophet of Islam, who nobody can reach the height of that spiritual perfection within the Islamic tradition, never missed his prayers until he died. There's no way of transcending the Sharia. As long as we have a body, as long as we're in this world, we're bound by the injunction of the Sharia. But since we are not only a body, we are also a soul, we are a thinking mind, there are other dimensions and aspects of Islam which together with the Sharia comprise the totality of Islam. But the idea that the Sharia is for the multitude and we can leave that behind if we are philosophers or saints or something like that, that's totally erroneous. And the best example of that are examples of the Prophet, of the Imams, of someone like Imam Ja'far as-Sadiq alayhi salam, who was both a great jurist and of course a great scientist and esoterist, one of the poles of Sufism, not besides being an Imam of Shiism. These people never reached a point at which they say, all right, now we've left the Sharia behind, we shall never practice it. For us who live in America today, it's very important to try to strike a balance, especially because it is so easy to flout the Sharia here. There is no network, there is no outside structures. It all comes back to ourselves, to decide exactly before God how, in the best manner, we can practice the Sharia. And how we can practice it differs from person to person. And one can only recall a spurious hadith, but nevertheless an important one, that says, or the Prophet said, you are living at a time when a person who does not practice 1/10 of the law will be condemned to the fire of hell. A time will come when he who does practice 1/10 of the law shall be saved. That is, certainly God knows how difficult our situation is. And the little one can do counts a great deal in the eyes of God. So it comes back to us how, with the best conscience, we are able to understand the role of the Sharia in our lives. But from an intellectual point of view, it is totally erroneous to think that each of us can create our own Sharia, or that we go beyond the Sharia because we happen to have read a few books or happen to be able to think a little bit, or that we can ever reach the highest levels of spiritual perfection without the solid ground of the divine law, which for Islam is also the concrete embodiment of God's will for us in this world. هذا هو. Thank you. I'll be glad to answer 2 or 3 questions.